Welcome to Lessons in Critical Analysis. My name is Dr. Mieke Thrymsdotter, and in this video we'll be looking at how to write a research paper using logic as a learning tool, a research guide, and as an organizational framework for writing that paper you are probably worried about. Before we go into writing a research paper, we should probably figure out what a research paper is. And in order to do that, it's probably easier to start with what a research paper is not. Although it might record a process, a research paper is not a how-to manual. It might have some personal history in it, but a research paper isn't a diary entry. It might seem a lot like a blog post or a newspaper article, but it's more than that. The job of a how-to manual is to teach you how to do something. The job of a diary entry is to be a personal record. The job of a blog post or a newspaper article is to be popular and make money. None of these are the job of a research paper. A research paper has 3 jobs. First, to share new discoveries, insight, and understanding. Second, to prove that the person who wrote it is a good scholar. And third, to prove that money spent for this scholar's work is not wasted. In other words, if you can convince people that your ideas are right, you will be considered a good scholar, which will make them feel good about giving you money to explore your ideas. In school, that means getting good grades on your assignments, which leads to a good GPA, which leads to a good job in the future. In academia, that means getting a good reputation, which then leads to the ability to get grants, promotions, and more money. Before we can write the paper, though, we have to do the research. I'm sure you've already learned about the research process, or else you're learning about it right now. But let's review it just in case. What is research? Well, basically, it's asking a question and finding the answer. You do this all the time already. Every time you ask a question, even a simple one like, "Have you eaten yet?" you're doing research. But research is also having an answer already and figuring out how to prove it so that other people believe it too. In some ways, this is the harder one because a lot of times you're going to find out that the answer you had at first wasn't actually the correct one. But that's great. That means you learned something. And as you keep testing your answer, when you are sure that it is correct as you can possibly make it, you will have done something that just might benefit a lot of people. If this sounds a lot like the scientific method, you're right. But can you use the scientific method on something that isn't science? Of course you can, and you should. The scientific method is based on logic, which is a method of reasoning as old as Aristotle. Logic depends on facts and evidence and is based on the idea that big truths can often be discovered by putting 2 or more little truths together in what we call a syllogism. In a syllogism, the littler truths are called premises, and they come in 2 flavors, major and minor. The end result, the bigger truth, is the conclusion. The argument is how all these things work together, and there are 3 basic methods. In one, 2 separate ideas lead to the conclusion. So, for example, red and yellow make orange, and autumn leaves are various shades of orange. These are not really related statements. But if I want to make a painting of orange autumn leaves, they'll look more natural if I mix red and yellow pigment than if I just use orange. The next is a process, where one step leads to the next. In Meredith Willson's The Music Man, for example, Professor Harold Hill tells the people of River City that playing pool leads to hanging around with the wrong kind of people, which leads to bad habits, which leads to, well, trouble, right here in River City. With a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. In the last one, the conclusion requires 2 premises to work together, like the offense and defense in football. So, for example, plants need the right amount of sun and dirt and water in order to be happy. The right amount of sun and dirt and water is usually found in a plant's native environment. So if you want a nice, easy to manage garden, grow native plants. Now, just like there are 3 kinds of syllogisms, there are 3 kinds of logical reasoning based on how certain we can be about the truth of the premises and the conclusion. They are deduction, induction, and abduction. If you want your argument to be unbreakable, use deduction. If you can't use that, use induction. And if you can't use that, move on to abduction. Deduction is the most accurate. In deduction, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It's like arithmetic. 1 plus 1 is always 2. Induction depends on past experience. If I do something 500 times and get the same result all 500 times, then I should get the same result next time I do it too. Abduction uses context cues to arrive at the most likely conclusion. Occam's razor states that the most likely conclusion is usually the simplest one. Think of it like a detective novel, where the great detective looks at a crime scene, puts the clues together into the most likely story, and then sets out to prove it. No matter which of these methods you use, there's a really useful question you will want to keep in mind while you're doing your research, and later too when you're writing your paper. That question? Why? This is the most important question you can ask yourself, because sure as there are stars in the sky, someone else is going to ask it too. If you cannot answer that question, well, you haven't done enough research yet. As we start talking about how to structure your research paper, let's take a brief look at how the research process works. First, you need a topic. What do I want to learn is a good way to start. Once you know your topic, it's time to go learn about it. If you're just starting out, Wikipedia is a great place to learn. Dictionaries, textbooks, websites, all of those places are great ways to get familiar with a topic. Next, start formulating a research question or working thesis. If you get lost, remember the 5 W's. Any one of those can guide you to a question or thesis. As you get more familiar with your topic, it's time to dive a little deeper. Look for scholarly articles and books about your topic, and make sure you know what kinds of resources are available to you. The resources you can access will influence the kind of questions you can ask and the kind of answers you can find. This will become your methodology. And there you have it. You've started your research project. If you're doing deductive or inductive research that's based on surveys, experiments, or data collection, you're all set. Go forth, gather the data you need, or data, analyze it according to your methodology, and see what happens. If you're doing abductive research, however, you're probably very confused by this point because you feel like you're kind of done. You've already seen everything there is to see, read everything there is to read, so there's no more research to be done, is there? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. For the abductive researcher, now's the time to turn all of the things you've read into a logical argument that will stand up to any criticism. Let's take a look at your working thesis, shall we? Here is an imaginary thesis statement from an imaginary student about an imaginary book. It is nicely focused. The imaginary student who wrote this, we'll call her May McKay, stumbled across Goody Goldfeather in an odd little library, fell in love with the mumblebees, and decided to write a whole paper about them. I am sure you have many questions. So do I. What are mumblebees? Who is Goody Goldfeather? What is the land of make-believe? Why is it classic? Where can I see it, read it, or whatever? Has anyone else ever heard of this Goody Goldfeather person in the land of make-believe? And what kind of significance are we talking about anyway? If our student is a good one, all of our questions will be answered. Eventually. When she started doing her research, May wasn't thinking about any of our questions. She was actually thinking about her own interpretation. Here's what she was really thinking when she started. Mumblebees are a metaphor for the distractions that prevent people from appreciating the magic of ordinary things, like sunrises and falling leaves and butterflies. Notice that this isn't her thesis. It's her conclusion that she came to after doing a lot of reading and thinking for herself. It's usually a bad idea to start your paper with a conclusion. The conclusion ends the story and opens the floor for discussion. You don't want to start your paper that way. Nobody will pay attention to your essay if you do that. They'll be thinking of what they would do and what they would write instead. The properly written thesis is a hook that draws the audience in, inviting us to learn. As May started her research, she found out that Goody Goldfeather's illustrated novel, The Land of Make-Believe, is widely known, highly popular, and has been written about a lot. Poor May was almost snowed under by the amount of work that has been done on this thing, but she now knows that her interpretation of Mumblebees was right the whole time. Now her job is to convince us. Luckily for her, she knows how to structure a logical argument. She already has her thesis, her hook to draw us in, and her conclusion, the thing she wants us to believe. Rule number 1 of any logical argument: define your terms and set the boundaries. You could also call this section orienting the reader. Academic scholarship is no different from a really enthusiastic thread on a fan site. For the popular dramas, say. You know how those work. One person says, "I really love this character, but I don't understand why." And someone else says, "Oh, it's because of this." And then people start sharing their interpretations and ideas and likes and dislikes and recipes, and before you know it, there's a whole community of friends who hang out online together and talk about the most random things. Now, if you want to join this community, that's great. But it's not polite to just jump in and start typing away. It's better to read what has already been written and get an idea about how the community works. Then, when you have something to contribute, you won't embarrass yourself. Academia is just like that. Some threads have been going on for hundreds of years. Some started yesterday. The difference is that these threads, these conversations, are recorded in journal articles and books rather than on internet fan sites. When starting the body of your paper, the most important thing then is to help new people catch up. They might want to read everything else for themselves someday, of course, but for now you should at least summarize the most important things so that they're not completely lost when they try to understand what you are going to add. The other thing you want to do is to show longtime fans, some of whom have been part of the community longer than you have been alive, that you respect the community, appreciate what they've done, and that you're not just babbling to get attention. Thus, the first section of May's essay will introduce all the important ideas that are relevant to her thesis. That means we're going to learn about Goody Goldfeather, at least a little, and about the Land of Make-Believe, and about what Mumblebees are. We're also going to get a summary of the scholarly conversation around Mumblebees, how it started in 1924 when Evelyn Brooklet received a copy from Midwinter and wrote a poem about mumblebees, comparing them to snowflakes, and what Orina Sensible wrote in 1940 about the influence of medieval mummers, and how everyone agreed with her until Austin Purr, writing much later in 1995, provided conclusive evidence that this was a ridiculous interpretation. And now we're all up to speed, and we all know everything we need to know about the literature on mumblebees. Now that everything has been set up, May Mieke is going to build her own argument regarding what the mumblebees mean, and why, and how. It probably won't take very long, to be honest, and she will likely use one of these syllogisms. This one. The major premise might be Goody Goldfeather's documented dislike of small talk in crowded cities, supported by a journal entry. The minor premise could be the Sunrise Queen's comment about quiet moments from Chapter 10 that echoes the journal entry. And lo and behold, the paper is complete. So much for Miss McKay and her mumblebees. You can do the same process with your paper, but what if you have a more complicated idea? The same process works, no matter how simple or how complex your project is. Divide your large ideas into smaller and smaller ideas until they can't be divided up anymore. Keep defining your terms, setting your boundaries, and proving each point, testing it for accuracy and connecting it to your argument until you're done. And that's how to write a research paper. Oh, by the way, here's how the video you just watched follows these rules. The first slide was the introduction and hook. I'll be the first to say I'm not great at this. You've seen a lot of better ones, I'm sure. The next few slides, I defined my terms. What is a research paper? What is research? And set the stage for the focus of the video, which is, of course, logic. I used the relationship or networking kind of syllogism as a guide for my discussion, because I'm talking about things that are all interrelated. The major premise is that effective arguments use logic. The minor premise is that research also uses logic, and the conclusion is that logic is an effective way to write a research paper. For each of these premises, I defined my terms and provided examples to clarify meaning. Note that I've also cited my sources, giving credit where credit is due. In concluding my argument, I used what I had set up earlier and, once again, provided an example of how it works. This way, if needed, the conclusion of my argument can be used as a premise in another, more complex argument. Last, I concluded the video with a brief illustration of how these principles can be applied elsewhere, no matter how big or small your project may be. I hope this helps. Happy writing!